Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys my end of September wrap up. I have 13 books to talk about today. I'm gonna do my usual thing and talk about the books that I like the least and work my way up to my 5-star reads for the past couple of weeks. And as usual, I will link my mid-September wrap up in the cards above if you are interested to hear my thoughts on the books that I read in the first half of September. So the first book I want to discuss is The Duke I Tempted by Scarlett Peckham. I actually just finished this book earlier today. So Scarlett Peckham actually wrote one of my favorite romances of 2020, which is The Rakess, which is a brand new series of hers that she is publishing with Avon. But this book is part of a series that I think is either self-published or indie published. This is the first book, and it's essentially a marriage of convenience between these two characters. We have Poppy, who is a botanist, and we have Archer, who is a duke, of course. There is quite a twist to this marriage of convenience trope because Archer is actually into BDSM. Specifically, he is a submissive, and at the very beginning of this novel we see him go to this house and he gets whipped by essentially a dominatrix, but back then they didn't have that kind of terminology, and of course kink and BDSM wasn't as accepted as it is today, although of course it is still taboo. And we see throughout the book that Scarlett actually might be into being dominant in bed, so it seems like they're actually a good match for each other. But of course, in typical Scarlett Peckham fashion, there is plenty of angst and emotional scenes in this book. That was one of the things that I really enjoyed about this. Of course, I also enjoyed the BDSM rep. I thought it was really well done in a historical romance setting, but I did end up giving this 3.5 stars. Like I said, there were aspects that I really enjoyed, but on the other hand, I wasn't blown away by Poppy and Archer's romance, even though they have plenty of chemistry between the two of them. There was just something about their relationship that didn't quite work for me. Also, there is an incident that kind of sort of has cheating, but it just left kind of a weird taste in my mouth, and I wasn't a fan of how like the fallout and the aftermath of that was handled. Like, on the one hand, I get why Poppy forgave him, but on the other hand, I wanted Archer to grovel a lot more. So yeah, I definitely kind of have mixed feelings about this book, but I still definitely recommend it if you're looking for a darker historical romance that has BDSM representation. Next book I want to discuss is Brooklyn Air by Serena Bowen. This is a book that Brie from In Love and Words, I will link her channel up in the cards above. I talk about her a lot in my videos now that I'm thinking about it, but she is my absolute favorite, or one of my favorite romance booktubers. And this is one of her favorite romances of 2020 for sure. So this is like a billionaire, friends to lovers kind of hockey romance. So Nate got very rich by owning this Apple-like company. It's a tech company, and he also owns the Brooklyn Bruisers, which is a hockey team. And so Becca, our heroine, she has been his assistant for the last 7 years, and Nate has been pining for her basically the entire time that they've known each other. That was one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book, was the pining. It's pretty mutual between the two of them, but Nate was definitely the one really pining for Becca. But they were both afraid to ever make a move because they didn't want to cross that employer-employee line. So I'm kind of flipping between like a 4 and a 4.5 stars with this one. I overall enjoyed it a lot. There were just things plot-wise in the second half that I just didn't love as much as the first half. It's not anything that's necessarily problematic or anything. It's just my personal preference, I guess. And I also liked the incorporation of different team members from the hockey team, because this is book 1, I think, in a hockey romance series. So I definitely recommend checking this out if you are looking for a really sweet and nerdy hero and just a great friends to lovers billionaire romance. Next up, we have Lover Eternal by J.R. Ward. This is book 2 in her Black Dagger Brotherhood series. I also gave this book 4 stars. So this book centers on Rage, who is one of the vampires in the Brotherhood, of course. He was cursed, I think, a couple hundred years before the story starts, and that, like, when he gets really angry, he turns into this dragon-like monster. And because of that, he never pursues any committed romantic relationships. And then we have Mary, who is our heroine. She is actually a human who is suffering from pretty late-stage cancer, so she is very sick, and it is all about their romance. And again, one of the things I really enjoy about this series is the different POVs that J.R. Ward uses. Like, it's not just just Mary and Rage, for instance. We also get the POV of one of the villains and some other side characters. I really liked the romance between Mary and Rage, but I'll be honest with you guys, I actually enjoyed the romance in book 1 more, which is interesting because most people don't really love that first book. Most people kind of like the books as they go on in the series. I think book 3 is a lot of people's favorite, which I'm really excited to get to because this book kind of ended on a cliffhanger, like not for the main couple, but for one of the subplots. So I'm definitely looking forward to reading the next book in October. Next book I want to discuss is Bane by LJ Shen. This is book 4 in her Sinners of Saints series. So I have now completed the series with the exception of the prequel novella, which is called Defy. I never plan on reading that, to be quite honest. So Vicious, which is the first book of the series, that's definitely my favorite. It's also a favorite in the romance booktube community in general. I would put this book actually in second place. The other two books, Ruckus and Scandalous, were okay. There were some good elements, but they're just not my favorite. Dark new adult indie romances like this aren't my favorite in general, if I'm being honest, but this one was unique and there were definitely aspects that I really enjoyed. Yeah, this is definitely the darkest installment of the 4 books. So this centers around Jessie and Bane. Jessie, 2 years before the book started, she was gang raped by 3 boys from her high school, I believe, and one of them being her current boyfriend at the time. So she's definitely dealing with the trauma of that. So definitely a huge content warning for gang rape in general. Also pedophilia. I'm not gonna really spoil what the pedophilia is about because that's kind of a plot twist-ish. But just know that that exists in this book. The very beginning of this book, in fact, is Jessie dealing with like literally the immediate aftermath of that rape. So yes, it is very dark. So then we have Bane, who is our hero, and just like in all of the other books in the series, he is very arrogant. He's a bad boy, definitely like an alpha hero going on. And we have Jessie's stepfather, Darren. So Darren and Bane go into a deal together where in exchange for Bane befriending Jessie and like helping her heal and come out of her shell, Darren is essentially going to invest money into a business idea that Bane has. So I definitely enjoyed the first half of this more than the second half. That's why I'm giving this 4 stars. I overall really enjoyed the relationship between Bane and Jessie. I thought that it developed in a very organic way, you know, kind of they're not enemies necessarily, but they definitely don't start off on good terms, 2 friends and then eventually 2 lovers later in the book. Overall, this was an enjoyable new adult series. I still think that you can just read Vicious and be done with it. I don't really think that these other books are all that necessary. They're just not my favorite romances. Next up is The Virgin Gift by Lauren Blakely. This is technically book 2 in a smutty novella series, but you can definitely read them as standalones. I did read the first book, which was called The Engagement Gift, a few months back for one of the Smuttathon vlogs. So this is essentially a friends to lovers novella. It's very smutty. One of the hottest books that I've ever read, to be quite honest. It was so good. I highly recommend the audiobook for this as well. It's only like 5 hours, so you can definitely listen to this within like a day. This does incorporate the virginal heroine trope, which I think a lot of people kind of hate that trope, and I can kind of see why, but in this case I thought it was really well done. I also loved the open communication between the 2 main characters. I can't remember their names at the moment, but I did really enjoy this, I promise. And there's even some aftercare incorporated into this novella, which if you don't know what that is, it's a term typically used in the kink community, but I think that anybody can benefit from it, and that's essentially just taking care of each other after you have sex to make sure that they feel loved and safe and all of that. But yeah, I definitely recommend this if you're looking for a really short, smutty novella. Also, I did give The Virgin Gift 4 stars, and then the next book I'm going to talk about I also gave 4 stars, and that is Royally Screwed by Emma Chase. This is kind of like a smutty version of that movie, The Prince and Me. I feel like that came out back in 2004. It's definitely not a recent movie by any means, but that's definitely what this book gave me vibes of. So this centers around Prince Nicholas. He is the prince of this fictional country called Westco, which I think is a weird name for a country, but okay. And he meets this girl, Olivia, while on a trip to New York City, and it's their romance. I really enjoyed it. I don't have much to say. I just really recommend recommend it if you're looking for a fun royalty romance. Next up, I'm going to talk about the first 3 books in the Bloodline series by Rochelle Mead. So those books are Bloodlines, then we have The Golden Lily, and then the 3rd book is The Indigo Spell. So I don't really have much to say about these books individually. I will say that when you binge a series like this, the plots kind of run together, but there are very distinctive plots in all 3 of these books. But essentially this series, it's a spin-off of the Vampire Academy series, one of my favorite paranormal series ever. Just to tell you a little bit of what this centers around, we have Sydney Sage. She's an alchemist, and in this world, alchemists are humans who are tasked with protecting other humans from finding out about vampires. There's also 3 different kinds of vampiric creatures in this world. We have the Moroi vampires, they're the good guys. They're also magic users in conjunction with being vampires. There's also Dompiers, which are half Moroi and half human beings. And then we have the Strigoi. They are essentially undead vampires. They don't have any souls. They are definitely the villains of both this series and the Vampire Academy series. And this series overall definitely has a very different vibe from Vampire Academy. It just feels a bit more mature and sophisticated than Vampire Academy. Like, they're both definitely YA series, but that series just feels a little bit younger than this one, if that makes sense. Also, this series takes place in Palm Springs, California at a human boarding school. And the reason why they're in Palm Springs is because Sydney is tasked with protecting this Moroi vampire who was featured in the Vampire Academy series, but she's definitely much more of a major character in this one. And there's also Adrian Ivashkov, who was a pretty major character in Vampire Academy. I think he was introduced in the 2nd book of that series, but now he is definitely a main character in this one. And oh my god, the romance between Sydney and Adrian is just everything. And yeah, I just love the 2 of them together so much. I think Adrian just deserves to be so happy, because at the end of Vampire Academy, his heart was definitely broken by the person that he was in a relationship with before. I don't want to spoil who that is in case you haven't read the Vampire Academy series, but yes, he just deserves the world, and I love him so much. And seriously, these books are like candy. I had no problem reading the first 3 books in the span of a week. Yeah, if Rochelle Mead ever decided to extend this series, I would just keep picking them up because they're just that good to me. Oh, and before I forget, I gave all 3 of those books in the Bloodline series 4 stars. They are just very solid reads for me. The next 4-star read I have is Majesty by Katharine McGee. This is the 2nd and final book in the American Royals duology. For those of you guys that don't know, although I have talked about this series a lot recently on my channel, this is about a fictional United States where instead of it ever being created as a democracy, it was created as a monarchy. And so we are following the royal family of the United States. And overall, I really enjoyed this 2nd installment. I loved the first book so much because it is just like the perfect royalty teen soap opera. Just all of the drama, I lived for it, you know? And this 2nd installment definitely still had the drama and the intrigue and all of that, but I overall just wasn't a fan of how the story ended for a lot of the characters. Some of the characters I was really happy for, and others I was like, really? Like, I just feel like they deserved better. I just don't really know what Katharine McGee was thinking in the way that she ended some of the character arcs, so that's why I couldn't give this one 5 stars, but I still definitely recommend the duology. It's a fun time. So if you're looking for something that's like Gossip Girl with royalty thrown in, you will definitely love this series as much as I did. So next I'm going to talk about my 5-star reads. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Love Wrecked by Karina Halley. I'm so happy that I finally read another Karina Halley book. This was like the epitome of a comfort read for me, and I'll get into that in a minute, but this is essentially about Daisy and Ty. And Daisy is from the United States. She ends up taking a trip to New Zealand to see her sister get married there. And Ty, our hero, is best friends with Daisy's sister's now husband. Essentially what happens is is Daisy's sister and her husband. Their honeymoon is to sail from New Zealand to Fiji, I think, and that's like a 10-day sailing trip. And so essentially Ty and Daisy end up going on this sailing trip with them so that it's more safe, because if it's just two people sailing out in the Pacific Ocean, that is definitely not safe. You need someone to be keeping watch at all times and things like that. But what happens is that they end up crash landing on a deserted island. And this is also kind of an enemies to lovers thing. I mean, I don't think they hate each other's guts, but they definitely don't start off on good terms, Ty and Daisy. And what made this such a comfort read is that, first of all, Karina Halley wrote this during the COVID pandemic. And you can tell in her writing that she was trying to comfort herself and also comfort her readers. I don't have any particular passages memorized or anything like that, but there were just lines throughout this book that kind of referenced wanting to kind of be back to normal, because in this story, you know, they're just trapped on a deserted island. They have no idea when they're going to be able to get back to civilization. You know, so there's oddly kind of similarities between being trapped on a deserted island and living during a pandemic. So I just found it very comforting. I also really enjoyed the romance between Ty and Daisy. And of course the smut was awesome because Karina Halley is amazing at that. I also loved that their happily ever after didn't involve them having kids, because throughout the book you can kind of tell that Daisy especially just never wants kids, and that's totally fine. I personally don't want kids either. And so at the end of the book, they end up adopting some dogs and a cat, I think, and just living their best lives. So yeah, if you just want a comfort read with low angst romance, of course there's drama because they land on a deserted island, but other than that, everything's pretty low-key in terms of drama. I would wholeheartedly recommend this. I could not give it less than 5 stars. Next 5-star read I want to talk about is How to Be Less Stupid About Race by Crystal M. Fleming. What I really appreciated about this book is that it talks about some really unique topics that I haven't read about in other books about race, such as So You Want to Talk About Race by Ujoma Oluo, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. You know, all of these 3 books, while they all talk about race and what it is to be an anti-racist, they all talk about them in very different and unique ways. And so this book in particular, I'll kind of look in the table of contents to give you an idea. One of the discussions that I really appreciated was on racial stupidity in the Obama era. That's something that I personally wasn't aware of, because when Obama was president, I was like in college the entire time, I think, almost. So I was just busy with other things. I wasn't involved in politics. There's also a chapter called Trump Country, so she does talk about President Trump, but not in the way that you might think, actually. It's very interesting because she brings up essentially the fact that Trump is not all that different from presidents that we've had in the past. You know, the main difference is that Trump is just more upfront about his views, you know? I mean, we've had some really shady presidents in the past, but the way that they give speeches is in a very like veiled and vague way, the way that they talk about race specifically. So I thought that was very interesting. There's also a chapter about interracial love, which I thought was really helpful. And the last chapter of this book, which I think is called Becoming Racially Literate, that was probably my favorite chapter in the book because it actually gives instructions on what are the next steps in terms of educating others about race and, you know, working towards racial justice and things like that. So I think this is an amazing resource if you want to educate yourself more about race. I think people of all races can learn a lot from this book, not just white people. Yes, just highly, highly recommend. And then the last book that I'm going to talk about is Marriage for One by Ella Mays. So this is a reread for me. I read this book back in January of this year, so it has been quite some time. And at the time I gave this 4 stars because going into this book, I thought it was going to be more of a comedy kind of than a drama. I didn't realize how serious this book was going to get. So essentially this is a marriage of convenience story about Jack and Rose, like the Titanic. And this is essentially a very, very slow burn romance. As you can tell, this is a chunky book. It's 500 pages. First of all, I highly, highly recommend the audiobook if you can access it. Audible Escape has it, even though Audible Escape is going away at the end of the month. But if you have time, I would definitely recommend listening to this. This is definitely one of the most intense and intimate romances that I've ever read. I also just love the way that Ella Mays wrote the slow burn. And then in terms of the dramatic parts of this book, so essentially Rose, who is the main heroine, she becomes sick about halfway through the book. And so Jack has to take her to doctor appointments. She ends up going through surgery at one point. So I did want to throw that out there, that there is illness going on in this book in case that's something that might be triggering for you. But going into this reread, you know, knowing that this book takes that turn, it definitely helped me enjoy it a lot more. And I did end up giving this 5 stars upon reread. It is probably one of my favorite romances ever, not just 2020. This book just has a very unique vibe to it. And I also really enjoyed the sunshine / grump trope that we have going on, because Jack is definitely a very, very broody hero. And Rose definitely is like the sunshine kind of character. She definitely has a pep in her step. So yes, just highly, highly recommend if you are looking for a really great marriage of convenience slow burn romance. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this end of September wrap up. I hope you enjoyed. I would love it if you would leave a comment down below. Tell me about the books you read this month, and I would also love it if you wanted to discuss any of the books that I brought up in this video. Also, I would love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!